down there and thought, I can't see what I'm actually going to say. But it's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be at my first Awaken. Hopefully not my last, but we'll see how this goes. You can vote afterwards. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit of my own personal story, because obviously I'm aware that most of you don't know me. And I'm often speaking in contexts where a lot of people would have heard my story before, but probably no one here has. So, as Joy said, my name's Natalie. I live in Hastings, or Astins, as I would more likely call it, which is on the south coast, and it's quite a deprived part of the UK. A lot of times when I speak to churches in the north in particular, they think that Hastings is just in leafy green Sussex and must be a really lovely place to live. It is a lovely place to live, but we're like a pocket of deprivation in amongst all the wealth. So when I was a kid, I grew up in relative poverty in Hastings. We lived on the 16th floor of a block of council flats. The 16th floor was actually the top floor. So as I've started telling my story more and more, someone has pointed out that's actually the penthouse. And my mum is absolutely loving that because she is getting to retell her story that she used to live in a penthouse. But the truth is, it was a council flat. We couldn't afford central heating. I was on free school meals and things like that. My early childhood was affected by a whole load of things you don't really want your childhood to be affected by, from debt, domestic abuse, disability, the death of a sibling, a lot of adultery, and then eventually my parents got divorced. And my family was pretty dysfunctional, to be honest. But I didn't really know that I was in a dysfunctional family, and I didn't know that I was growing up in poverty because everyone around me was in exactly the same situation. So for me, it was just perfectly normal. In fact, when I realised that I was in poverty was actually at the age of 15 when I started going to church because I liked a boy. So I wasn't looking for Jesus. I wasn't interested in spiritual things. I just liked this boy. And I found out that he went to church. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll go along to church. And on the first Sunday that I went to church, this guy got up, the guy I liked, and gave his testimony. And he talked about what Jesus had done in his life. And as he talked about it, he just wept. And I was just sat there thinking, what a loser. Like, what's wrong with this guy? Why does Jesus make this guy cry? And so I really went off the guy straight away. But obviously, you'll be pleased to know that I did then encounter Jesus for myself. And that though I'd only gone along in the first place because I liked this guy, Jesus clearly had other ideas for my life and really grabbed hold of me. But I really, really struggled in church because suddenly I found myself in a lovely but very middle-class church. And so not only did I grow up in poverty, but I'm from a very working class family as well. And I'd be keen to stress those two things are not the same thing. There's a lot of people who are working class who do have money. You can earn quite a lot of money in some great working class jobs. But we were in poverty and in a working class family. And so I joined this church, and even some of the things that they did to try to welcome me actually had the opposite impact, and they were quite alienating. So before I became a Christian, I had never seen food served in the way that nice middle-class Christians... I mean, it might just be middle-class people in general, not specifically Christians, but I'd never seen food served where you go to... Well, I'd never been to someone's house for dinner other than, like, my grandparents for Christmas or whatever. And so I suddenly I was invited around people's houses for dinner, which was lovely, but they would put food on the table, like a bowl of potatoes and a bowl of vegetables and a bowl of meat, and they would say, "You're the guest, you go first." And I genuinely would feel such anxiety because I wouldn't know what I was supposed to do. I wouldn't know, do you take the food in a particular order? By the way, if you do, I still don't actually know. No one's ever told me that, so you can enlighten me. But I also remember like sitting there trying to calculate how many people around the table and how many potatoes does it look like are in that bowl, and how many then do I take so that I look grateful but don't look greedy? And honestly, these things cause me great anxiety. I also had never been to see napkins used in someone's home other than at Christmas, and particularly like material napkins rather than paper disposable ones. And I remember just like thinking the first few times I went to dinner at people's houses, like, am I supposed to wipe my mouth on this? Because I mean, I know washing machines exist. I did know that much, but I was a bit like, this feels wrong. Like I'm going to make this dirty, and I don't know. Just all these things were a real challenge to me. But what's funny is I only started talking about this stuff about 20 years after I became a Christian. And some of the people who used to have me for dinner then came up to me and went, that's us, and you never told us, and we never knew. And so in 20 years or whatever of having people around for dinner, they'd never thought, I wonder if this person's comfortable with eating in this way. And these are lovely people, so that's nothing against them. It's just if you don't think about it, then you can easily, your very act of welcome can be quite alienating. And so I really struggled with eating meals around people's houses. But also I really struggled, I didn't know how to behave as a nice Christian. Some would tell you I still don't, but I do feel like I've learned a few things along the way. But so it meant things like, my mum raised me, if someone asks you a question, always give them an honest answer. That does not go well when you're new in church and you're asked what you thought of the sermon this morning, if your answer is, I was really bored. And I just said that because I thought I was supposed to tell the truth. It wasn't till I'd been a Christian for a while that I realised that maybe a little bit of sugarcoating or sweetening it in some way, or finding the one encouraging thing that I could say rather than just going, yeah, no, I was totally bored. I fell asleep a little bit. And so I got myself in all sorts of trouble. I didn't fit in church life at all. I found church quite difficult. But I did really want to follow Jesus. I just didn't really know how to. And I thought, do you know what I'll do is I'll go away on a gap year program and I'll give a year of my life to just following Jesus. Now, you've got to understand at this point, my church, they'd seen me now for 3 years, and so they knew that God was at work in my life. That progress might have been slow. It might not look great to other people outside our church, but they had got to see what God was doing at work in my life over 3 years. So they were really happy to write me a reference and send me away. I don't know, the way I phrased that might be how it actually was, but I went off to this other church. And this other church was in a much smaller community and was a much smaller church. And I don't think they knew what had hit them when I turned up, to be honest. They'd only had one gap year student before, and she was amazing. So the year before, they'd had this wonderful 18-year-old who had been raised in a very secure, loving Christian home. And when she got there to give her year to Jesus and to the church, her main question was, how can I serve? What can I do? You know, anything they asked her to do, her answer was always yes, and can I go the extra mile? And then I turn up after they've had a year of the glory of her, and I'm not like that at all. I turn up and everything they ask me to do, I'm like a 2-year-old because my first question's always why. And to be honest, that hasn't really changed about me. I'm still someone who often my question in response to being asked anything or told anything is why. Like, I feel like that's just something of what I want to understand. Like, I wasn't trying to be awkward. I wasn't trying to be difficult. But you can imagine if you've had someone who's like your model gap year student, and then you get someone who will never just say yes, or how can I serve, or yeah, I'd love to do that, or whatever, but just always says, why do you want me to do that? And I remember having a conversation with a woman who was discipling me, who was like, you know, you need to come to the prayer meeting tonight. And I said, I don't really want to. And she said, no, but you've got to. It's part of, like, you know, your year. And I was like, well, your husband's not going. So if he doesn't have to go, why do I have to go? And I genuinely wasn't trying to be attitude-y, although I appreciate now that I was. But I was, it baffled me. If he doesn't have to go, why do I have to go? And I didn't understand it. So after about 3 months, I got kicked off this thing. So it really felt to me like I was like, oh, Jesus, have a year of my life. And he was like, no, you're all right. 3 months will be enough, thanks. And I can joke about it now because it's many years on, but at the time it was utterly devastating. At the time, they basically, it so blindsided me. They were amazed I hadn't seen it coming, but I really hadn't. And so when they told me that the leader of the church wanted to come round to talk to me, I was excited. I thought, what are they going to ask me to do? I was like starting to have dreams of things that I might be able to do in the church that would maybe be grander than anything they would have ever let me do at that point in my life. But they turned up and they basically said, yeah, we're sending you home. You've got to go back to Hastings. And it was devastating because what it confirmed to me was people like me don't fit in church. I already had come out of a background of quite a lot of rejection in my family, and so I was already not certain that God wanted me. I already thought that God might have made a mistake. Or, you know, when they talk about, well, you know, God's chosen you, and I'd be like, I don't, has he? How do I know if he has? Or if, you know, I've just snuck in somehow without him noticing, or what if he changes his mind? And so for me, this experience of being sent home by that church felt like it was just confirming I don't fit in with the people of God, therefore I must not be a person of God. And so then I ran away from God, hard and fast in the opposite direction, and threw myself into all sorts of other things, got myself into drugs and partying, and basically was trying to look for anything that would satisfy. And outwardly, I looked like I was having the time of my life. And if you'd asked the Christians who knew me, I was saying to them at the time, no, this is wonderful, this is better, I'm all good, thank you. But actually, I was deeply depressed. I was self-harming. I was well aware that God was pursuing me and that I didn't really have any alternatives except to follow him. But I didn't really want to follow him because I felt like he'd rejected me. So I was very confused. I was very angry with God and basically tried to get away from him. But what happened was I would wake up in the middle of the night with an old song, Lord, you have my heart and I will search for yours. Jesus, take my life and lead me on, just going through my head. And it would make me so angry because I'd be like, you don't have my heart. I'm not searching for yours. I'm trying to run away from you. And I was all like, God, you told me I've got free will. Why won't you let me go? But in his astonishing mercy, he didn't let me go. And he pursued me and came after me. And so after about 6 or 7 years of really throwing myself into everything else I could and recognizing there was no satisfaction in anything, I came back to Jesus. And coming back to Jesus was wonderful. Just suddenly realizing he wanted me was incredible. There were verses in the Bible that I'd never read before, like in 1 Corinthians, where it talks about that God hasn't chosen the wise or the noble or the strong. He's chosen the weak and the foolish. And I could definitely identify with that. So I was like, oh, he wants people like me. This is incredible. I was so shocked, but I still had to then try and fit in church, or just try and be okay in church. And I found it really, really difficult. And so I'm telling you my story in quite a bit of detail because it's relevant to what I am going to come on to talk about impacting our communities. But for me, coming back to church, I said to God, I will go anywhere in the world, just don't make me go back to Hastings. And then I felt God say to me very clearly, I want you to go back to Hastings. And then I said to God, okay, but I'll go to any church except the church that I became a Christian in. And again, I felt God say, I've tried this in other ways. I've said, God, I'll do anything but be a millionaire. But when I do that, it doesn't really seem to have the same impact. But God told me to go back. And for my first 13 Sundays back in church, someone offended me. Well-meaning, lovely Christians who were trying to help me would say things to me. Like, by this time I had a heavy smoking habit. And they'd be like, people I didn't even really know would just come up to me on a Sunday and say, you need to give up smoking. And you know what? It's not like I disagreed with them, but I kind of thought, well, if it was that easy, I'd have done it. What was actually worse for me was people coming up and saying, well, when I became a Christian, God delivered me instantly from smoking. And I'd think, well, that's really wonderful. Well done you. But obviously that hasn't happened for me. And so I found that really hard. I had a number of Christians who'd come up to me and say, you need to get a job. And I was unemployed at the time. I was sleeping on the floor in my mum's because she couldn't afford a bed for me. And I agreed with them that it would have been good if I could get a job. But again, if it had been that easy, then I probably would have got a job at that point. And it was really interesting to me that what held me in church obviously wasn't people who just came up randomly to me on Sundays and said things like that. What held me in church was an amazing small group. So I was like kind of assigned this small group with a bunch of people I'd never met before, which was great for me because it meant they didn't all know I'd got kicked off my gap year. They didn't all know my history. They didn't have these kind of preconceived ideas about me. But they just totally loved me. They did things that were amazing. So they never once told me to give up smoking, although I have now given up smoking. I know that God did want me to give up smoking. They didn't tell me you need to get a job. They said things like, is there anything we could do to help you? Do you want a job? They asked me that sort of question. They just came about it from a very different angle. They asked me what I thought some of the difficulties were in me getting a job and whether there were things they could do to help me with that. So one of the things that was difficult for me was that to even get to some job interviews, I needed a car. Like I couldn't really get around without a car. And they bought me a car. So they clubbed together as a small group and they bought me a car. It was a dodgy old banger. It was a Fiat Cinquecento, I think it's called, and I learnt that Fiat really does stand for fix it again tomorrow. Sorry if anyone's got a Fiat. But they bought me this car, and I remember my mum saying to me at the time, my mum's not a Christian, and she was like, they shouldn't buy you a car, because if you quit smoking, and cigarettes weren't the only thing I was smoking at the time as well, she's like, if you quit drugs, if you quit smoking, you'd be able to save up, you'd be able to get a job, and you'd be able to get yourself a car. Why have they bought you a car? And they never said anything like that to me. I think they just were like, you need a car, and we think we could show you the love of Jesus by buying you a car. And honestly, I tell that, even though that was like, I don't know, 20-something years ago now, I tell that story all the time because it meant so much to me. Not because they bought me a car, because it told me, you're part of us. You belong to us. We are yours, you're ours. This was a breaking down of barriers, breaking down of divisions, because it communicated something to me of their love for me. And that helped me to understand God's love for me. Also, my small group, instead of saying to me things like give up smoking or get a job, they asked me all the time, what's God saying to you right now? And for a whole, I think probably 18 months to 2 years, I only heard God saying two things to me, really. One of them was, I want you. And that was like, I mean, it's actually taken a lot longer than that for that to really take root and for me to believe that he did and he does want me in his family and people like me and people whose backgrounds are much worse than mine. But that was what he was saying over and over and over again. You're not rejected. I want you. I want you in my family. And the other thing he was saying to me was, I want you to stop watching EastEnders. Which is the weirdest thing, and I'm nothing, if anyone watches EastEnders, I don't think EastEnders is evil or anything, but for me, I grew up in a household where you just watched TV constantly, the TV was on all the time, and I was spending so much of my time basically smoking and watching soaps on TV, and it felt like God was saying, this is what I want you to give up for me, and it felt really costly, and it's funny saying it now, because now I would find it probably quite easy to give up something like that. But it's interesting, isn't it, that what God was saying, what the Holy Spirit was doing, was actually not what a lot of the Christians around me wanted me to be hearing God saying. And so that had my small group who just wanted to know what's God doing and how can we bless you was an incredible blessing, and it really held me in church. They were a total gift from God to me. And one of the things that they taught me is Isaiah 61. I'd never read Isaiah 61 before, and I'll just read it to us quickly. This is like one of my favourite passages of the Bible, and I know you probably know it really, really well, but it never hurts to read it again, does it? And so it says this, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. And I love this passage of scripture because it feels like it's my story. It's like what God has done in my life, and learning that the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord anointed Jesus first and foremost, because obviously he tells us these words are about him in Luke chapter 4. But then that same Spirit anoints us, anoints you and me, to proclaim good news to those in poverty, to bind up the brokenhearted, to bring beauty where there's been ashes, to bring freedom for captives. But then I love that it goes on. It doesn't even just stop there. That would be good enough, wouldn't it? That would be amazing enough. But then it says they, the poor, the brokenhearted, the captives, the prisoners, the morning, they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. And what's really encouraged me over the years is learning that oak trees are some of the slowest growing trees to reach maturity. Like even the fastest growing oak takes at least 20 years before it's a mature oak tree. Most of them take more like 50 years. And I found that so encouraging, because what I found in church life is that we love a testimony of, I was a drug addict and God miraculously met with me, and I've been free ever since, and I've not touched anything. Those dramatic things are beautiful when God does that, aren't they? But actually, even when God does that, all of us know that our journey of sanctification is probably nowhere near as quick as we would like it to be. And I don't know about you, other people's journey of sanctification, I have more of a problem with how slow that's going often than I do my own, because I'm like, why aren't you changing fast enough? As well as why aren't I changing fast enough? So it really encourages me, the patience of God, that he lets us grow as oaks of righteousness, changing us from one degree of glory at a time. He's so kind and patient and gentle with us. But also, not only do people in my sort of background and any sort of background really get to be oaks of righteousness that bring glory to God, we also get to be the rebuilders of ancient ruins, the restorers of places long devastated, those who renew ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. One national newspaper called Hastings Hell on Sea. It's actually all right. It's not that bad. It's got a lot of problems, but there's a lot of beauty about it too, and I'd recommend it as a holiday destination. But Hell on Sea sounds to me like a place that's been devastated for generations. And so as my small group and other Christians came into my life and started explaining this passage to me, they're like, not only is there good news for you, not only is there healing of your brokenness, not only is there freedom from your captivity of various forms, not only is there beauty that can come out the ashes of your life, but actually you get to be someone who knows you've been anointed by the Spirit of God to go and restore others, to go and rebuild and renew other people. And it really matters, because in our country, there are 60% of people in our country would identify as working class or poor. And like I said, those two things aren't the same thing, and people describe themselves however they want. So people would say to me, you can't describe yourself as working class anymore, because I ended up going to university. About 8 years ago, I bought my own flat, so I'm now a property owner. I mean, more middle class than that. During COVID, I bought an avocado. So that's me, middle class now. But the truth is, this British Social Attitude Survey that takes place every year, but every 3 years asks questions about class. If they ask me, I would still identify as working class. I still feel that my values are very, very working class. And if 60% of the population say that they are working class or in poverty, and actually that number hasn't changed since 1983, then when we look at our churches, we need to look around and go, are they in our churches? Are our churches places where people with my sort of background and a lot worse than mine can come in and not only find Jesus, but find belonging, find community, and not even just find that, but find maybe leadership opportunities? Even though, my life still today, I lead a national charity, but if you ask any of my team, they will probably tell you that I'm a little bit chaotic. I'm not great with a diary. I do things like I look at my diary and say, yeah, I can go and speak at that thing without thinking, have I got any time to prepare that talk? Or there's still a lot of things that where I'm very connected to my past, if I'm honest. But actually, just because I'm a bit chaotic and I'm not good at diary management and can't therefore necessarily do really well on a rota, shouldn't exclude me from being able to serve in church life or even in leadership in church life. And the Evangelical Alliance did some research a few years ago and found that in British churches, 81% have a university degree. 81%. At the time they did that survey, the percentage for the nation as a whole was 27%. So you see that massive disconnect. Now it's more like 40%. But even if it's 40% in the nation and 81% in our churches, that's a massive disconnect, isn't it, in who we're reaching out to in our communities. And I'm sure I don't need to persuade you that going for reaching out to people in poverty or in working class backgrounds in our communities is just a non-negotiable part of being a Christian. We see it all through the Bible. It's something that at Jubilee Plus we speak and teach on a lot, just that God has called us to be those who reach out to actually people from all walks of life. It's not that I'm saying we shouldn't reach out to the rich and wealthy. They need Jesus just as much. And I love that in the Gospels we've got stories like Zacchaeus, the wealthy tax collector. We are supposed to offer Jesus to all people. But there is something in the Bible that I think is very clear in every section of the Bible, that the people God's got on his heart more than maybe any other are those who are in poverty, who are marginalised, who are vulnerable in any way. In the Old Testament, we often see it's talked about the widows, the orphans, the poor and the foreigner. And it's not to say we should only help people who fit into one of those four categories. They're more types of people. So in that society back then, a widow would have been the most vulnerable adult in the community. An orphan would have been the most vulnerable child in that community. The poor would have been the most vulnerable insiders, and the foreigner would have been the most vulnerable outsiders. What God's basically saying is vulnerable people need to be brought in. Vulnerable people need to be included. And there's so much. When I first became a Christian, I used to hate reading the Old Testament law. I'd be like, what's all this stuff about mixed fabrics and boils? And it was all a bit weird to me. But as I've matured as a Christian, I've found so much beauty in the Old Testament law, but particularly to God's provision for people in need around us. I love things like God said to his people that when you're farming, it was an agricultural society, so he's saying when you're farming, don't go back a second time to pick up all the grain that has fallen by the wayside. Don't go back and pick it up, because you need to leave it for people who haven't got any food so that they can get it instead. And for me, I think, what's a modern day equivalent of that? Like, how can we be a blessing to people in our communities who don't have enough food? Obviously, we can run things like food banks and pantries and community groceries and things like that, and they're all wonderful, and I'm personally involved in some of those things. But even things like, if you go to the supermarket and you love a bargain, maybe if you've got enough money that you don't have to go to the reduced stuff, that you don't have to go and take all the stuff. I don't know, I've got friends who they go to the supermarket at the exact time they know all the yellow labels are being put on stuff, just because they love a bargain. They're not hard up, they're not struggling. And a friend of mine said, well, actually, maybe our equivalent of gleaning is that we leave those reduced items for people who actually need to go shopping at that time of day, because it's the only time they can afford. But I love that God's put that in the law. Let's think about ways that actually we don't need to gather everything around us. I think of that with my income. You know, a lot of us, as we start to earn more and more money, we just adjust our lifestyle, don't we? We maybe move to a nicer part of town, or we buy a nicer car that won't need fixing again tomorrow, and we maybe go on slightly nicer holidays, or whatever it might be for you. It might just be that, you know, we have takeaways more often, or we go out for dinner more often without thinking about it. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things, by the way. Please don't mishear me. But what if instead of adjusting our lifestyle, we actually decided, I'm just going to set my lifestyle here, and then anything I get on top of that is going to be excess, like gleaning, and I'm just going to leave it for other people. Not literally just leave it lying around for other people, but find ways to invest it for the good of those who've got less than we've got. One of the things I find fascinating in the Old Testament law as well is it says things that wages should be paid on time. I've got a family member who works in an industry where they always pay invoices only the third or fourth time of asking. And in her industry, that's just the normal. They always wait till the red one comes through, and that's when they pay it. It's totally unbiblical. I mean, she's not in a godly Christian environment anyway, but it's totally unbiblical, isn't it? We need to pay people on time. It also says don't charge interest on food. I think that's a fascinating one. It says don't make a profit on food and loans. Imagine if our society was like that. And obviously there's lots of good Christian things that have been set up for the good of those in debt in our communities, where actually if we can set stuff up so that people aren't... I've been in overwhelming debt. When I backslid, when I ran away from God, I got into tons of debt. I ended up having debt collection agencies writing to me, and was advised by a solicitor in the church to declare myself bankrupt, because he thought it's the only way you'll get out of your situation. I actually ended up getting a job 2 weeks later, so I didn't declare myself bankrupt. But actually, what was crippling me in the debt was the interest on it. And even though, we've had big news headlines many years ago about things like Wonga being shut down because of exorbitant interest rates, that doesn't mean that exorbitant interest rates have gone away. And even if we look at supermarket profits, if supermarkets weren't allowed to make a profit on food, then actually they wouldn't be posting billions of pounds of profits every year, would they? I know they make money on other things too, but I wonder how we as Christians can have an impact on our communities by actually thinking through some of these things and thinking, can we do it differently? Can we serve the most vulnerable in our communities? Can we serve those who've even made stupid mistakes and bad choices? Because a lot of the debt that I was in was because I was into drugs and partying, and some of it was because I couldn't pay the rent. For me, it was a mix of both. And so often, I think we can cut off our compassion for people based on the decision that they've made or the decisions they've made. I think of it like this: like if someone comes in and says to you in your church, "Oh, I'm starving. Please, would you help me?" If we say to them, "What's your story?" If they say, "Well, I grew up in poverty. My parents haven't fed me," and they're a little kid, we'd immediately want to help them, wouldn't we? Something of compassion would kick in with us. But if someone comes and says, "Well, I've spent all my money on drugs this month, and so now I've run out of money," I don't know about you, but something in my heart has a very different reaction. I don't find myself going straight to compassion. But what we see in the Bible is that God's mercy is never based on the decisions we've made. It's never based on how good or bad we've been. And I love the fact that the Bible says the mercies of God are new every single day, because I know that I've needed fresh mercy every single day. I love the fact that in the Old Testament, the whole society that God was putting in place was built on grace and mercy. The Sabbath year, every 7th year, if you'd got into debt, your debts would be released. Do you know debt is one of the leading causes of suicide in our nation, and it's one of the leading causes of marriage breakdown? If you knew that every 7 years your debts would be wiped out and you could start over, no one would need to contemplate suicide. And it wouldn't need to cause marriages to break down, because there would never be a hopeless situation. The year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, that's why the charity I work for is called Jubilee Plus, because it's based on the year of Jubilee, but also we're now in the new covenant when Jesus has come, so there's even more, it's better now. But the year of Jubilee says, if you've had to put your family into slavery because you couldn't support yourselves, then you get your freedom back. If you've had to give up land that's been in your family for a long time because you couldn't afford to maintain it and you got yourself into difficulties, you get your land back. It's like this giant reset button where God modifies the extremes of poverty and wealth and says you can't go on getting richer and richer and richer at the expense of the poor. But if you're in poverty, you are never, ever in a hopeless state, because you've only got to wait for the Sabbath year or the tithing year or the year of Jubilee. And these years come round time and time again and bring freedom. And the scale of the need around us is massive, isn't it, in our communities? And I don't know, I think for a long time I was talking to people who thought, well, if we have a change of government, that'll be the answer. And it doesn't matter what your politics are, a change of government is never the answer. It can be an answer, and it can make some difference, but it's nothing compared to the gospel of Jesus Christ that says, I've got good news for those in poverty. I've got binding up for brokenhearted. I've got freedom for the captives. So when it comes to impacting our communities, I've just got a few thoughts on maybe where we can start, or if you're already way into this, how you might press into it more. And I just want to tell you a few stories of kind of some of the stuff I've done in my local church, but also some of what some of my friends have done in their church settings too. Before I get into that, though, I just want to say that there's a lot of good stuff that happens in our nation, and that Christians don't have a monopoly on compassion and good works. But I do think there are distinctives. And during COVID, a lot of churches that connect with Jubilee Plus were saying to me, well, we've seen all sorts spring up. There was a woman and her mum in my community in Hastings who basically started running a food bank out the boot of their car. And actually, do you remember when we were all like hoarding stuff, because at the beginning of COVID, when the supermarkets, everyone was in panic, they were giving away toilet roll, when the rest of us, probably even us Christians, were thinking, there's no way you're getting your hands on my toilet roll. I don't know when I'm going to be able to get another roll of toilet roll. And they were amazing, fierce atheists, but doing good from the boot of their car because they wanted to help people who had less than they've got. But I do think there are Christian distinctives, and one of them I think is mercy. I think the mercy of God should set us apart, because mercy doesn't say to the person in front of you, tell me why you deserve my help, or tell me what you'll do with the help I'm going to give you. Mercy just says, what's the best way for me to show you the kindness of God today? It's a fundamentally different starting place. Mercy says, I'm not looking at your behaviour and determining if you deserve my help or not. I'm looking at the behaviour of Jesus Christ, and based on his behaviour is how I'm going to treat you, not based on your behaviour. Now, it does make, we still need to be wise, and we still need to make good decisions and think about what is best for someone, but it changes it from giving us an excuse to not do something to help someone to thinking, actually, I'm going to help you. The only question is, how am I going to do it? And I've been encountering people over the years who have told me every other organisation has said, we can't help you anymore because you've had too many chances, or because they're a statutory agency and their rules don't have any flexibility in them. If people can't find ongoing mercy in the church, that is something that is very hard to find anywhere else. We need to be people who don't say 3 strikes and you're out, but say, actually, we want to help you, and we will keep helping you, and we will keep helping you, even when it's hard, even when you take advantage of us, even when we think you're exploiting us. We're the people of God who've been shown extraordinary mercy, and so we will keep pouring it out to you. Now, like I say, it might mean we change what we do, but it's not do we do anything, it's what do we do. The second distinctive, I think, of Christian compassion, though, is the power of God. We've got the power of God, and so often in our nation, people are either really passionate about sort of social action, social justice, mercy ministries, or they're really passionate about evangelism. And the pendulum historically in the UK just swings from one to the other. We have seasons as Christians in this nation where we say, no, we just need to get back to talking about Jesus. We need to, and all those people who have been feeding people, well, they've become liberal do-gooders who now don't even talk about Jesus, because if they do, they can't get funding. So we better just come over here and we'll talk about Jesus. And then you've got the people over here going, what good is it to tell someone who's hungry about Jesus and let them starve to death? And so often we've separated these two things. I absolutely believe we are supposed to offer people hope for today and hope for forever. That people need hope for their immediate crisis, and they need hope for their eternal crisis. And a lot of the hope we need to give needs to be the power of the gospel of the things we can't do anyway. You know, if someone turns up at my food bank and they're terminally ill, I can't do anything about that. But I know one who can. If someone turns up and says, even what you're giving me at the food bank isn't going to be enough to feed us for a week, or, you know, for whatever reason they might be worried the food's going to go out. Well, I know a God who multiplies food. I know a God who does that. And I believe we are going to return to a day in our nation where we're going to see miracles of provision, where people might turn up at our food banks with a voucher saying, I actually don't need the food anymore. What I need you to explain is why that loaf of bread has lasted my family of 6, 3 weeks. When, you know, I believe God can still do that and does still want to do that. We must bring the power of God into what we're doing. And if we want to impact our communities, we mustn't leave kind of that Holy Spirit supernatural power outside the room. We must take it in with us. But also our third distinctive is the hope of the gospel. Living conscious that whichever room we walk into, if everyone in a room is a non-Christian and we are the Christians walking into a room, we are the ones who are anointed by the Holy Spirit in that room. We're the ones who have access to the mind of Christ in that room. We are the ones who are bringing light literally into the darkness in that room. So we mustn't, it's good to acknowledge that others have compassion, and some are more compassionate than we are anyway, and that's amazing. But let's not forget that actually we are specifically anointed by the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord, and we're the only ones who are. That's what the Bible says. So what does it look like? Well, one of the things, when I started working for my church in 2011, and one of the first things I said to my pastor was, can I go and ask local decision makers what they actually think the problems are facing our community? And first of all, he said to me, well, do we need to do that? Don't we know what they are? And I was like, maybe. But if we don't ask, then actually do we know? We think we know, and maybe we do, but by asking, we'll find out. The second thing he was worried about is, well, what are you going to offer them? Like, you know, if they say we've got this problem, that problem, what are you then going to say? And so I promised him that I wouldn't overcommit us. I mean, I may have when I say promised, I might have had my fingers crossed, but I did say to him, like, I know where the line is. I promise, I won't offer them too much. But I went and met with all the local decision makers, as many as would take a meeting with me on behalf of my church. And basically, so I met with the MP, the district commander of the police, the district commander of the fire service, some healthcare professionals, someone leading the community safety team, a couple of head teachers, the leader of the biggest social housing unit, and a couple of chairs of residents associations as well. And all I went and did was ask them 3 questions. My first question to them was, what do you think is the biggest problem facing Hastings? And it was really interesting because a few of them were like, what do you think? And I was really keen not to tell them what I thought, because the whole idea was I wanted to learn from them. And it was interesting that there were obviously some themes that emerged, but not all of them said the same thing, and that was quite informative. My second question to them was, what one thing, if it changed, would disproportionately affect Hastings for good? And that question's similar to the first one in that some of their answers were, well, the thing I just told you about, if that changed, that would. But it wasn't always the case. And I asked sort of a similar question with a just slightly different way of framing it, more because I was just trying to tease out of them a bit more information. And then my third question was, what would you like to see churches like mine do to help if we were able to? And at that point, I was clear to say I wasn't promising we would do anything they suggested, but I was promising we would do something. And I told them all, I'm meeting with all these other people, and what we're going to do, we're going to go back and we're going to look at your answers and what you've said, and based on that, we will do something. It might not be what you've asked for, but it was really interesting because out of that conversation, so that was around 2011, and half of them said that what they thought we really needed was a food bank in our community. And, in the way God just so beautifully orchestrates these things, at the same time, I started talking to a couple of people in my church who were hearing about food banks elsewhere and were like, we wonder if that's something we should do as a church, and we'd be willing to get involved if that happened. And so it was this beautiful dovetailing of what the community wanted, but also what people in the church were feeling God prompt and provoke them about. And so I was able to go back to those community leaders and say to them, I emailed them all thanking them for their time, and I said to them, if they'd asked for a food bank, I said, you said you wanted a food bank, we're going to do it. If they hadn't asked for that, I would say, I know you wanted us to do this, we can't do that right now, but this is where we're going to start with a food bank, and later we might be able to get to what you've asked for as well. I was also keen to point out we weren't going to do it on our own, we were going to do it with other churches, it wasn't just going to be us, and we wanted to do it in partnership with them, that it wasn't just we're going to go off and do that now, that we actually wanted a meaningful relationship with decision makers in the town. And at that point, what we also decided to start doing as a church was to send all those decision makers, and then when they moved on, their replacements and so on, Christmas cards, which would just say something handwritten that we were grateful that they'd done in the last year. It's a really simple and easy thing to do. But you know what? A lot of those decision makers, especially like your MP, all they get is grief. And actually, it was interesting because I worked for a parliamentary candidate who didn't win, and so the MP I was sitting down and talking to knew that I had been on the team of the opposing candidate, and so my MP was kind of astonished that I was genuinely interested and that I would thank her for things that she'd done. And I'm in two minds. I'm trying to decide whether to tell you who I'm talking about because it'll give away. I am actually not party political at all anymore, but my MP was Amber Rudd, who became Work and Pension Secretary. And so as our food bank started, it had been running then for a few years, she would come and say things like, well, isn't everyone who comes to the food bank just aware they can just come and get free food? Isn't that why they come? And I would be horrified at that comment. But we built a relationship over the years where I was really able to challenge, and along with others like obviously Trussell Food Bank Network and the Independent Food Network as well, we're able to really challenge her on some of these things. But because I was at the heart of her community, I was able to get her ear quite a lot more. But it also meant she was then so shocked when I would write her this Christmas card every year, basically saying thank you. I would thank her for something specific that she'd done. And because she knew that at that time my politics were quite far from hers and my views on poverty were quite different to hers, we can have an impact just by being kind to people. Luke 6 verse 35 says that God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. I'm not saying Amber Rudd is either of those things, by the way, just in case I'm aware this is being recorded and that sounded a bit like that. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is God is kind to people that I don't want to be kind to. I don't like being kind to the ungrateful. Do you ever have someone come and get help from you in whatever way you're helping people? Like even if you hold a door open for someone and someone doesn't say thank you, I don't know about you, but a little bit of me wants them to come back so I can slam it in their face. I mean, that's just honestly what goes on in my heart. It's public confession. And you know, like if you're driving and you let someone pass, they're supposed to do that little polite hand wave thing. I have been known when people don't do that to go like this just because I want them to learn. I'm just trying to instruct them. It's the error of their ways. But what's really funny is I'll particularly go from times I love praying in the car and worshipping in the car, and I'll be really doing that, and then I'll be like this to the person and be like, oh, maybe that's not quite in keeping with where my heart was at just 5 seconds ago. Being kind to the ungrateful, let alone the wicked, is hard. But there's something, even if we disagree with decision makers in our local community, we can have an impact on them by just thanking them. And also that means that when we do have something to complain about, when we do want to ask them to do something differently, when we do want to call them to account for an injustice or a bad policy or just a heavy-handed policing strategy or whatever it might be, we've got way more opportunity to do that if they know of us as kind and caring and actually committed to them and their well-being and not just in it when we want to complain about something. So our first thing was we went and found out what does the community need, and we did that as well by asking people who were in need what they wanted to. So we tried to go and ask the powerful and the powerless. We wanted to make sure we were getting... And what was interesting was actually there was quite a lot of synergy in what they thought, which surprised me. I thought they'd just be at different ends of what they wanted. But actually, a food bank was the thing that everyone seemed to want, and that was what we were able to do. But the second thing, after we'd sought the views of the community, was obviously what is God saying? And you might think, well, why have you said that second? Shouldn't that have been first? But actually, we said it second because if you just start with what is God saying... We don't always hear God clearly or fully, and sometimes we hear what we want to hear, and sometimes we hear what we already wanted to do anyway. And so we went that route of going community first and then trying to hear from God second, just because we felt it would help us be more open to what the community wanted than just what we kind of wanted to do anyway. I hope that's come out right. Like, obviously, we weren't wanting to disobey God or anything. And then thirdly, what's on the hearts of your people? If you're looking to have an impact on your community, like what's on your heart and what's on the hearts of the people around you? And obviously there's a ton of ways this can emerge. One of the things I love about getting to visit churches across the country is I get to see all the different ways that God speaks to people, God leads people to do something transformative in their communities. So often it can happen obviously through prophetic inspiration. So there's a woman in my church who I can never remember, she either had a dream or a vision of a woman dishevelled, dirty, broken, sitting in a bath and in utter distress. And God really impacted her heart, and she started praying, God, what is this you've given me? Like, she knew it was from the Lord, but she was like, what are you saying to me? And God started to reveal to her that he wanted her to help survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery. But my friend didn't know any, and not that she knew of, and she didn't know how on earth she would begin to connect. And she started trying to find out, are there other churches who are doing this? Because that's always a good thing to do, so we don't reinvent the wheel. But she couldn't really find anything that was quite right. And because I'd got these relationships with the police, I went and asked the police, and they said, it's not really a problem here. Turned out that wasn't true at all, and it was actually a massive problem. But at the same time, legislation was going through Parliament, and the modern slavery bill was passing through Parliament. And so the police knew they were going to have more responsibilities in this area, but less resource, no more resources to do it too. So because I had a good relationship with them through the things I've just explained, they invited me to a meeting, and they said, tell us what you could do as a church. And this is where I definitely overpromised compared to my pastor. He tells people that I practically offered them a trip to Barbados if they would let us work with them. That's not quite true. But I did say to them, if you need training, you know you're going to have more responsibilities. You know you haven't got any more resources. You've said in this meeting you don't even know how to spot the signs of human trafficking. Why don't we train you in that? And I said to them, we'll pay for the training, we'll deliver the training, we'll host it in our church building, we'll do any printing of resources that need to be done. I really was going a bit over the top. The only thing I wanted them to commit to was that they would send 20 police officers to it. And if they would commit to that, I would commit to everything else without permission. So I go back and I tell my church leader this, because they're like, great, yeah, that would be wonderful. Please, will you do that for us? And he's a bit like, how are you going to train anyone in how to spot the signs of human trafficking? Do you know how to do it? And I'm like, nope. So then we found a national expert and we paid them to come and do it. And we had 97 frontline officers on that training, because the police spread the word, and then the local authority realised we need to get people in on this too. The manager of social housing was like, I need all my managers to come and understand how to spot the signs of human trafficking. Do you know, though, that was amazing. And to date, we've now trained over 400 statutory staff. We've also trained 103 of them to roll out that training in their own organisations. So we don't do it anymore, which I'm kind of a little bit sad about, because it was a great way to have the church at the heart of it. But actually, we've empowered them to do it, and it's now rolled out through their organisations. Our police station in a little town called Hastings now has a dedicated anti-slavery unit where 16 organisations are free to go into the police station and work in that office. And I have a swipe card to go in and sit and work in that office if I want to work in it. But do you know what? Actually, that's not what God told my friend at all. He told her that she was to support survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. And from the moment God gave her that dream or vision to the moment she actually started coming alongside survivors was about 8 or 9 years. And it was really hard for her to wait patiently. And I think it was even harder for her when she could see God was doing some stuff with us, with the police, but it wasn't what he put on her heart. But that opened the doorway. So now we, as a church, support 12 survivors of modern slavery at a time. We support them when they're identified. They're referred to us from migrant help, and then they're often moved away from us to somewhere where they haven't got so many connections that are bad for them or could be bad for them, getting re-enslaved. And so we support 12 at a time. It's a very small project. There's actually 4 people in our church who have been involved in this project from start to finish, but we were able to support 12 people at a time. And it all started through God just giving someone a dream or a vision, but she had to wait years to see it start to be fulfilled. So if you've got something God put on your heart years ago, let me just encourage you, don't give up on it. It might just be that God's timing is longer than most of our timing most of the time. The second thing is workplace inspiration. So I know a bunch of people who just from where they work have just seen the needs of their community. So in one of our partner churches, actually in North America, they realised that there was a massive need for dentistry, because there you have to pay for it, there's no free dentistry. And they realised there were a whole load of homeless people or people with addictions who were just not getting any of the dental care they needed. But in the church, they had a dentist and a dental hygienist. So they just decided that they would go part-time from their practices and set up a dentistry in the church. Isn't that amazing? I don't know here whether we could quite get away with that. I'm sure it would be hugely complicated. But the principle of what skills have you got? So in one of our partner churches at Jubilee Plus, there's a guy who's a mechanic. And he just thought, do you know what? I can teach other people to be mechanics. So he takes referrals from the job centre and from the youth support team. And so young people who haven't managed to get a job, haven't got any qualifications, haven't done well at school, or people in their 20s who've been unemployed for more than 2 years, he takes them and he trains them one at a time to become mechanics. And so far, he's got a 90% success rate of those going on, not all to become mechanics, but all going on to find jobs and then being able to hold down a steady job, which is incredible, just from one guy using his skills. 2 women in my church, they both were working in schools. One of them was a teaching assistant. One of them was a school counsellor. Actually, she was counselling in schools that were in the area immediately surrounding Grenfell Tower. But they both noticed that actually there are kids that are 7 years old that are at risk of exclusion from school. And if you get excluded from school as a kid, your odds of going into a youth offending institute are much higher. Your odds of going into prison then become much higher. Your odds of becoming addicted and ending up in poverty, all those things, all those markers. But they're like, how wrong is it that at 7 years old, your behaviour could determine all that future for you? So they looked into a charity called TLG, Transforming Lives for Good, and they set up education mentoring in our church. And we've got 9 volunteers. That's all. 9 volunteers who are doing that education mentoring. They support 11 kids per academic year. And so far, having done this now for about 8 or 9 years or so, we have a 100% success rate of those 7-year-olds who are on the at risk of exclusion lists still being in school. And that's for all of them, whether that was the kids that are now 15 or the kids that were done last year. Not a single one of them has dropped out of school. That's community transformation, because that's the next generation. That's these kids who would potentially be ending up in prison, in criminal activity, in drugs, in gangs, in county lines and things like that, who actually have been stopped from doing that because 2 women saw a need in their workplaces and said, we think we could do something about that. I also think a lack of skills can be really helpful. So I often tell people that I don't really have any life skills, and to be honest, that's still quite true of me. In fact, just last week I was staying with some friends of mine, you guys know well, and one of them said to me, "Oh, do you want to make yourself a sandwich?" I do know how to make a sandwich, but I said to her, "Could you just not watch me while I do it?" And it's really weird. I've been a Christian now for 32 years, and yet still I feel anxious if I might have to prepare food, because I just never learned how to prepare food. And I do know how to make a sandwich, but it just makes me feel nervous if I think someone's watching me. And actually, that's something to remember, that even someone who's come out of my sort of background 30 years later can still be struggling with some of the basic life skills. I have the privilege of having a PA who often says she's utterly astonished that I can stand on a platform and speak, but I literally can't work out how to use a printer. Or I got lost in a hotel, and couldn't find my way out. And I phoned her and she was like, "What do you want me to do? I'm like, not even anywhere near you. How am I going to help you?" I was like, "I don't know. How am I going to get out?" She's like, "I don't know. You're just going to have to keep walking around." I have a distinct lack of life skills, but for me, that's been an inspiration for how can I help other people who don't have life skills. So, I mentioned to you my overwhelming debt. Debt is a massive problem where I live. It's estimated that there are 23,000 adults in overwhelming debt in Hastings. And Hastings only has a population of 90,000, including kids. So that's a huge proportion of adults. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to get trained up in how to handle money well. I'm going to learn how to run a budgeting course. And then I started running the budgeting course in my church, but being able to say to the people who came on it, I was in loads of debt too. I didn't know how to run my finances either. And so sometimes a lack of skills can be the very thing that God says, I'm going to take that weak and shameful area of your life. And part of the redemption of it is not just that you get to be better with money than you were in the past, but it's that you get to bless others by teaching them something that you didn't know. And I love that God does that. I think that's the Isaiah 61 thing, isn't it? I get to become a renewer and a rebuilder of others, even in the very areas where I've not known what I'm doing and have had no skills. One more, and then I'll finish up. But so I also think our most painful experiences in life can also be used by God for our good and for the good of others. And I want to be sensitive about that, because I know that in any room of, probably 2 people, there'd be people who've been through extraordinary pain and extraordinary difficulties. But I often think this is part of the redemptive beauty from ashes that God is committed to, when he'll take some of our traumatic experiences, some of the things that have just been the most awful things we've been through, and will not only heal us and bind up our broken hearts and restore us, but will then give us ways that we can help others. And so just one example of this, in one of our partner churches in Liverpool, there was a couple in that church who their child was very, very sick and was in Alderhay Children's Hospital for a very long time. They didn't know if he was going to make it or not. I think he was 6 or 7 years old at the time. And what they noticed is, if your parents have a sick child there, you can move onto the grounds. but there's not really any support for you. There was one chaplain who I think was run ragged and was doing a great job, but nowhere near enough to get around all the people whose kids are in, imagine how the state you're in if your kids are that unwell and if you don't know if they're going to make it. And their child did make it. He came out, I think he was in there for several months, but when he came out, and he's now healthy and he's doing well, but they just thought, we've got to do something. And so they started a ministry called Someone Cares. And they basically came alongside the chaplain and said, would you appreciate some Christians who just could come along and support you and pray? I had the privilege of going in with them and praying for a couple whose baby was, like newborn baby, was desperately sick. And this couple just sort of saying, we used to have a faith, but now we just don't know. And just being able to weep with them, being able to pray, being able to lay like a finger on their little baby. That's all we were, allowed to do through an incubator, and stand there with them, put an arm around them and pray for them. But they don't just pray for people. They give pajamas to the kids so that the kids have a nice, regular, clean, new, fresh pajamas. They give toiletry bags and chocolates and things like that to the families, because they recognised you're staying in this place, but you haven't got, usually you've left home in an emergency. You haven't got anything with you. So they just have all this stuff made up. And that charity was just a little thing in one hospital with a bunch of Christians from about 3 or 4 different churches committing to volunteering week in, week out. But that's got picked up by a national Christian organisation called the Cinnamon Network, and is now being rolled out across the whole country. So if that's something you think, I'd love to do that, they would love to hear from you, and I could happily connect them with you. So in terms of impacting your communities, I think there's a whole load of ways that God speaks. I think it's important to ask the community, what do you want? I think it's important to ask God, what are you saying? And I think it's really important to then look at, well, what skills have I got? What lack of skills? What prophetic words? What dreams? What vision? What anything that God may be speaking to you can be a helpful way to think, what's my first step or what's my next step into making a bigger impact on my community? I think I'll finish there, and happy to take any questions, I guess. Is that?
I would say, Nat, you're a really brilliant storyteller. That's gone really quickly and really inspired us. I've got one question, and then we'll see if people want to ask questions, and maybe you can stick around and talk to people if they want to before they go. My question is, the process that you just talked about, do you have that written down or available anywhere? And how would people connect with Jubilee Plus?
Sort of is the answer. Basically, we get asked this a lot, and then it's one of those things we keep thinking we must get around to actually writing that down somewhere. So on my work programme for this year is getting that all written up. But in the meantime, you can connect with us. We're online, so it's Jubilee Plus, like the word plus. It's a really complicated web address to say. So jubilee-plus.org, or you can email us at admin@jubilee-plus.org. We're on most social media. That's just Jubilee Plus. But you can connect with us through any of those ways. And probably if you want us to write it up, the more of you who email asking us to, the quicker I'll probably end up having to do it.
Cool. Has anyone, maybe we've got time for just a couple of questions, if anyone's got any questions, and if not, you might have some packing to do to get ready to go home.
Yeah, so we've got partner churches across the whole of England, in Scotland, in Wales, in the Netherlands, and in North America, actually. We're not really international. We are a UK charity, but the 2 in the Netherlands and a couple in North America have just asked if they could become partners and see if it works for them in their context. So they've sort of signed up for a year, and they'll review it. Actually, the one in Canada that's been longest, they're now in their 3rd year, so they have stuck with us. But we're predominantly focused on the UK, and we've got partner churches in every part of the UK, lots up in the Lake District. I'm obviously down in Hastings, but my team's spread across the country as well. So got members of the leadership team of Jubilee Plus who are in Chesterfield, Bristol, Lowestoft, Eastbourne, and pretty much all over. So we try and network with churches all across the country, but something that's really important to us is to have meaningful relationships with churches. So we try to do that and try to make sure that's possible, because that's what we're looking for. A bit like I've been hearing about Ground Level, we're very relational, and so if we can build relationship with you and be a blessing to you and serve you, but also learn from you, that'd be amazing.
Can you tell us a bit about what you do, like with the churches and what?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is we resource churches, and there's a number of things. So often when I've met people who are really engaged with social action or social justice, they haven't always got a great theology that goes with it. So sometimes it's more because of their political leanings or their personal upbringing, or they know some people in poverty. So one thing we do is we do a lot of like kind of theological stuff to have a robust theology around poverty and justice. So we've got like online courses you can join around that, or some you can just get off our website. They're freely available to anyone, some that are just for partner churches. We provide resources, like we've got a prayer resource, how to pray about poverty in the UK, because I realised I struggle to pray. I really care about poverty, but my prayers feel so pathetic a lot of the time. You know, like, God, would you stop the cost of living crisis? Doesn't feel like a particularly dynamic prayer. So we put together a resource with a whole load of other charities, actually. So we work with the likes of Christians Against Poverty and Welcome Churches and Hope into Action and Safe Families, whole load of other charities. So they wrote content based on their specialist knowledge. So it's basically like a little magazine of how you can pray about poverty. We've got a kids curriculum, 10 sessions for 5 to 11-year-olds on things like generosity, mercy, justice, obviously at an age-appropriate level. We've then got the same 10 sessions but for 11 to 18s, and then the same 10 sessions as an adult discipleship course, which I always think is just the less fun version of, because the kids ones have games, the youth one has some games and some fun stuff, and when you get to the adult one, it's just, you know, videos and discussion and a workbook. And we also do leadership training for people who are currently in poverty or have been in it very recently. So we don't call it leadership training because we've run focus groups on it where we've been told, if you put the word leadership in it, I won't come because I'll assume it's not for me. And we've also, this is very shaped by people in poverty. So we were told things like no content can be longer than 15 minutes. Not just because people aren't necessarily used to being in an academic setting, but also because of ADHD, because of vaping and social anxiety. So there's a whole number of reasons why people struggle to sit and listen for more than 15 minutes. So it's called Formed, as in formed in the image of God and transformed by the Spirit of God and conformed to the likeness of Christ. And it is leadership training, but we don't call it that. And partner churches can nominate people in their churches who they think that would be a good fit for, who wouldn't go on any of their traditional leadership training models, certainly wouldn't go to Bible college or whatever, but they see leadership potential on, maybe because they're leading on their estate, or they're leading in their community, or they've just clearly got we've had drug dealers on it. So in March, we had a Class A drug dealer. He encountered Jesus a year ago. He's definitely a leader, but he's been leading for bad, and now he wants to lead for good, but wouldn't call himself a leader. We had a woman on it who slept in an industrial bin with her 4 kids when she was homeless, pulled out her own teeth with pliers because she couldn't get a dentist because she had no fixed abode. And when she went to A&E, they said, sorry, you need to go to a dentist. She ended up getting infected, going back into A&E, so that was a bad decision, as in, like if they'd seen her in the first place, that wouldn't have had to happen. She comes to us and she says, I don't know why my church leaders nominated me. I'm definitely not a leader. Within 5 minutes, you're like, this woman is dripping with leadership anointing. And it's been wonderful to just train people and then see them putting leadership into practice, but also to see them going, I think God might be telling me I'm actually a leader. So we've had people who are on this in March, we run it twice a year, who have preached in their church when they never would have done that. With one guy who got a hoodie printed that says, stop me in the street and I'll pray for you, and he now walks around Manchester town centre, the city centre, basically with the idea that he was so shy. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of tangent that one because it's one of the things I'm particularly excited about. But leadership training, resources, we do a lot of online stuff, we do in-person partner church days. We've got a social action MOT to help you review what you're doing and hopefully to provoke and inspire you into more that God might have for you. We've got a social action workshop, which is where some of the content I've talked about today is that kind of drawing out of your church community's hearts, what God might be saying. So yeah, there's a whole load of stuff that we do. I probably haven't mentioned half of it, but A lot of it's on our website. A lot of it's free to anyone, and then there's some stuff that's for partner churches, but you can clearly see the difference, I think, when you go on it. If you start clicking on stuff and it asks for a password, but yeah.
Well, if you've got any questions for Natalie, then please do stick around. I'm going to ask her to pray for us, because I think she carries something for the church, for our nation, and I'd love some more of that. So is that all right?
Yeah, I mean, why don't you, if you're comfortable to, I don't know, do you lift your hands in ground level or put your hand on your heart or whatever? If you've got a posture that is your way of saying, God, I'm open to you doing whatever you want to do, then why don't you adopt that posture? Father, we thank you so much that you are such an extraordinarily merciful God. Thank you for the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is good news to those in poverty. That is the binding up for the brokenhearted. That is freedom for the captives. And God, I thank you you've called us to make a difference where you've put us. Thank you that we're not where we live by accident. We're not in our communities or neighbourhoods or even our streets by accident. We are where you've put us deliberately. And we want to be used by you, Jesus. We want to see people's lives restored. We want to see hope come where there's only been despair. We want to see light in the darkness. We want to see you lifting people out of the ruins, that they might too become oaks of righteousness for your glory, and that they may go on to renew and rebuild and restore others. So would you help us to live more aware of the anointing of your Spirit, to do those around us good, and to do our communities good. And would you give us the strategies, the plans to make that happen? And God, I just want to pray for anyone who's had dreams that haven't yet been fulfilled. God, would you give them the energy to go again, to believe again, to press in again, and to see what you might do. In Jesus' beautiful name, amen.